Dylan Cozens of the Ottawa Senators, a part of this year's top fantasy hockey overachievers that you're going to keep in the back pocket for next season.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, my fantasy fanatics? Welcome back inside the lab. It's Flippin' Steele here on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, your daily source for all things fantasy and playoff hockey. Shouting out the everydayers who make us their first listen every single day. Also shouting out our friends at FanDuel, who today's episode is brought to you by. New customers right now get $5 down and win. Get $250 back in bonus bets. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. End of today's show, Steele. The meat and potatoes of today's show. Fantasy hockey risers, overachievers, guys who were far down draft boards that ended up finishing with a lot of fantasy value. Surprising names that I think, if we remember correctly, you can benefit next season. However, the playoffs are well underway, and it's been a fun few days of hockey.
Yes,
and
it
so
has.
much more to come. Over to you, wherever you're looking, because I know you're fired up about a few different angles.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly recap some of the game ones that have taken place. Obviously, yesterday, a lot of really crucial game ones as well. But I want to specifically talk about the ones that started on Saturday. Flyers take game one on the road against the Pittsburgh Penguins. You mentioned
Huge.
Porter Martone, game-winning goal in the last couple of minutes in the game. Absolutely rips one by Stuart Skinner. So he looks confident. He looks confident with the puck. He looks like he's been here before, and that's what you're kind of getting with the attitude and the atmosphere of the playoffs. And with Porter Martone specifically, a lot of guys for Philadelphia stepped up. We're actually going to talk about Dan Vladar on this episode for Fantasy Risers this season and as a goaltender going into next year. So shout out to you for mentioning Martone as an X factor for the Flyers. Obviously, I'm super excited with that game one big win statement game from the Minnesota Wild, 6-1 on the road. I talked about how playing on the road or home ice advantage is very important in this series for the Dallas Stars and for the Minnesota Wild. Taking that game one on the road is absolutely crucial for the Wild. So that's a big win for them. The big boys step up. Joel Eriksson, Matt Boldy, Kirill Kaprizov, I believe, all had 3-point nights. Quinn Hughes, I actually can't remember if he had a couple of points in that one, but he was great.
He had an assist.
Brock Faber on the back end was all over the ice. He actually might have been one of the best players on the Minnesota Wild team that entire game. He was fantastic. So that was great. That was great as well. But yeah, I mean, as we're talking, the Avalanche and Kings game just ended as well. 2-1 victory at home for the Avalanche in that series that we mentioned. I believe that's going to happen. That's going to take us. That's going to be a sweep for the Colorado Avalanche, even though it was a close game. So really a great atmosphere so far for the postseason.
And let's not forget, how about the ageless wonder, Frederik Andersen, turning aside 24 shots for the Ottawa Senators, 22 shots. In my opinion, you're going to having to be getting a lot more rubber on whoever is in net for the Ottawa Senators to be having some success in this series.
That's
because
pretty difficult, though.
Neat and tidy, Carolina will take care of business here, especially if a healthy Freddie. We know this guy is unflappable in the cage. If anything, this guy is battle tested, and his numbers in the postseason still, I don't have them in front of me, but I know they're solid. So look out for this streaky goaltender and the Carolina Hurricanes as well. Let's bring it back here to the overachieving side of things, because this is an angle that needs to be covered. And, the Flyers have a couple of players on this list. And you mentioned Porter Martone. Before I get to the overachieving, more fantasy angle, because you and I are going to dip in and out of keeping you guys up to date on the postseason and also keeping you sharp for next year's draft prep all summer long. Porter Martone immediately, Steele, I said it on yesterday's show, take in the kid's stat line. He's got only a handful of games in the NHL. He's in the meat grinder of the postseason against Evgeny Malkin and Sidney Crosby. And he's got a nasty game-winning goal, 3 hits, a block shot, and almost 16 minutes of ice time per night. This is credit due to whom? Rick Tocchet behind the bench. This guy is getting it done and pushing the right buttons, because when I look at his deployment, and this is something you can also remember for next year, because these guys are going to be here in Philly, Travis Konechny, Christian Dvorak, and Porter Martone. Perfect balance from the coach for the young rookie to be playing alongside a couple of good veteran presence. I like what's going on in Philly. And then you take a look at these overachievers in Vladar and Trevor Zegras, and it's not perhaps a huge shock that they are where they are. So kudos to Dan Vladar big time. He is proving that this regular season was not a fluke and that maybe next year more fantasy value to be had. I think if he has a big performance, Steele, a couple of more good games, he's fallen right into 0G territory, and he will not be slept on this upcoming draft.
Absolutely. We've talked about him pretty much every single waiver wire episode we can in the second half of the season. You know, we talk about how thin the goalie market and how volatile it can be throughout the year in fantasy hockey, and he provided a lot of value to a lot of people who picked him up and who took a chance on them, especially down the stretch where, again, he was the big factor of why they made the postseason with his incredible play. So, yeah, we got the fantasy hockey risers of the season, guys who were in the preseason ranked really low, but finished very high at the end of the year. And obviously there's a couple of different ways you can look at this. It obviously depends on fantasy format and what your points, what the system points, point system is actually in your league. But when we look at it from our standpoint in our categorical formats with our fantasy hockey listeners out there in our casual and competitive leagues, these are some of the top guys here. So obviously guys that are off the list, Cutter Gauthier on some factors in fantasy point leagues. He had an incredible year. Darren Radish, of course, who was ranked outside the 250, finished top 50, I believe. There's a lot of different ways you can look at it, but this is the categorical format here. So as you can see on the graphic here, if you're watching on YouTube, but if you're on audio, I'll list the names off. Steven Stamkos, Pavel Zacha, Dan Vladar, Trevor Zegras, Jet Greaves, Nick Schmaltz, Dylan Cozens, Brock Nelson, Matt Barzal, and Scott Wedgwood. Those are the guys we're going to be highlighting on today's episode. And we're going to be highlighting them throughout the entire offseason as well. And guys who you should be targeting as depth pieces for your fantasy team next year. So I know you wanted to start off with Dylan Cozens. Let's go there first because I think he's been absolutely incredible for the Ottawa Senators. Just an up-and-coming team with a lot of up-and-coming players. We know what they're capable of doing. They actually probably would have finished top 3 in the Atlantic if they got way better goaltending from Linus Ullmark on the back end. And obviously the leave of absence didn't help. They kind of collapsed there with their backup goaltendings, that goalie carousel we like to throw out, the term we like to throw out there a lot. But Dylan Cozens in a full regular season with the Ottawa Senators, 82 games, didn't miss one, 59 points, second career high of his second high of his career here, 28 goals, 31 assists. He brings the physicality. He can get up to 200 plus hits, which he did this year, actually a career high of 215, 200 plus shots as well. When you factor in all of the facets of the skill that Ottawa Senators have moving forward, he's going to be one of those top players for this organization.
Absolutely. And he's also now, when you bring 60 point, kind of with regularity, I believe I'm comfortable projecting that for him every single year.
More than comfortable, for sure.
200 plus shots on net with 200 plus hits, Steele. And also now basically in the last, all the way back to the start of his career, 40 plus penalty minutes all day long. And then you look at exactly what you have here on that sexy graphic. Shout out to ChatGPT, I think. So I'm feeling that big time, Steele.
Yes, sir.
Is where you take a look at where he has gone up in the draft ranking. I think you're starting to pay attention to him as a Banger League beauty. He gets that seal of approval of Steele and Flip's Banger League beauty when you're bringing 200 plus hits, which, by the way, I got this list up here. That's good enough for 16th in the NHL. So when you're bringing top 20 in hits, you're bringing this year, I think he had 60 plus penalty minutes, Steele.
59, I believe.
59. So those are angles that, at least for fantasy, because right now I look at that second line for Ottawa after they got dealt with in game one. Cozens, Ridley Gregg, Brady Tkachuk, Claude Giroux, Tim Stützle, Drake Batherson, the other three that make up the top 6, they're going to have to generate scoring chances on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Because Carolina wants to play clamp down hockey, and that will not end well for this young Ottawa team. However, next year, headed into the draft, Dylan Cozens, he's got to fall into that sexy kind of fantasy, almost, I don't want to say a power forward, but when you bring that many points and that much peripheral love, I think you can make the argument that he's a power forward. Maybe he doesn't play a prototypical Tom Wilson type game. However, he's bringing that kind of categorical love that you got a couple of those guys, Steele. you're in business.
You really are. I would almost throw him into that same category or same tier as a Joel Eriksson-Ek, Vincent Trocheck, where you can
Most
get
definitely.
all peripherals throughout all peripherals when it comes to fantasy points. And obviously, when you look at the graphic here, you can see the difference of where he started the season for where he finished. 107 different rank system here. He was preseason ranked 139th, finished 32nd in our categorical league. So Dylan Cozens is definitely one to watch out for next year, but we got a lot more of Fantasy Hockey Risers coming up after the break.
And a lot more fantasy hockey coverage all postseason long. You're trying to stay sharp. You're trying to stay ahead of the game. We will help you do just that all summer long. Draft prep, sleepers, and mock draft Mondays, not too far in the future, Steele. We'll have some fun this summer. Then we'll get to the mock drafts. We got more sneaky players. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. The NBA playoffs are here. Every possession matters. Every matchup is magnified, and every game swings a series. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a great way to get in on the action. You bet $5 and win $250 back in bonus bets. Just to open the app, you got in play, you got all kinds of props. You love to get in on that first basket scorer. FanDuel is your spot. Check out FanDuel.com today to get started. FanDuel.com today to get started. FanDuel, play your game.
And once again, thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Make sure you go check out the Everydayer Club here on Locked On Podcast Network. $5 a month or $50 a year. You get ad-free episodes plus the Discord server chats with Flip and I and all of the fantasy hockey community out there. We really do appreciate all of that love and support. Subscribe button, the follow button. We appreciate you out there. That's why we do what we do every single day, Monday through Fridays, when you can find our episodes. I've actually got the Montreal Canadiens Tampa Bay Lightning game going right now. Montreal up 1-0 from a Josh Anderson rip top corner. So that one's underway, and that one is very exciting so far from what I can see in the first period. But let's get back to the Fantasy Hockey Risers. Let's get to the Philadelphia Flyers portion of this segment because we've got two players on there. We got Dan Vladar, who we talked about. We also got Trevor Zegras, two guys who have been so crucial once again to this team and the success they've had this year. Dan Vladar, a preseason ranking of 264. He goes up 184 spots, finishing the season 80th. Trevor Zegras, 229th in the preseason, up 167 spots, finishing 62nd in the league. So I'll throw it over to you because you can start with either one of those players, but these are guys who I don't think anyone had a lot of big expectations. I knew that maybe with Trevor Zegras, we knew with the change of scenery that it could be a fresh, a good reset, a restart for his career and in a new scene, new setting with a new organization. Dan Vladar, though, I knew that, or we kind of talked about maybe it could be up in the air as being the number one guy, and Samuel Ersson hadn't shown that much confidence in his game, but Dan Vladar, I think it's his now moving forward.
It's got to be his now. And Rick Tuckett's got his guy. He's 28 years old. He only has 157 games under his belt. So as much as he's been around, I would say you got to give this, I don't want to say kid, you got to give this guy what he has earned. 29, 14, and 7 this year, 906 save percentage, a 242 goals against. And when you look at a 906 save percentage, and I know we've got to look at it a little differently than in years past because that number has changed. Right? We know that getting by with a goaltender with a 906 save percentage is a blessing these days. So when I also, you take a look at what Philadelphia has been able to do, they've insulated their goaltenders. 25.5 shots against per game steal. That is fourth best in the NHL. So this team is pointed in the right direction. This is what happens when you get good goaltenders. They are in the playoffs ready to make some noise. And look at what happened in game 1 against Pittsburgh. 17 shots on net. They were all over the Penguins' big guns. Crosby was cheesed. That was a masterclass from Ricky T behind the cage or behind the bench. And if that's what is going to continue to happen, those are the fantasy teams you feel comfortable investing in because even on their bad nights, they're defensively sound. This is the Philadelphia Flyers we're talking about, a goalie graveyard. And why is a guy like Trevor Zegras, who has come into this season with all of the defensive lapses you have ever seen, bad decisions, that is the perfect place for this man to rejuvenate his value. Over to you. Quick Zegras take and wherever else you want to go.
Yeah, I just think he's been good. And when you look at all of the skill that's coming up in that organization now with Porter Martone that we mentioned, you got Michkov, who had a very, subpar season as well. But we know what he can do offensively when he's got that confidence in his game. And if he comes into training camp and into the season in, physical form, not, kind of out of it. But yeah, these two guys jumped up the fantasy value standings here. And Trevor Zegras just having a career year, 67 points in 81 games, 167 shots. You would like to see that number go up a little bit, but he's back to playing almost 19 minutes of average ice time. He lost that a little bit in the last couple of seasons with the Anaheim Ducks, obviously with injury and just the lack of proper mindset on the defensive end of the ice and just kind of losing his passion for the game, I think. And then you look at Dan Vladar and him being 28 years old. And I just don't think he ever had that really good opportunity to show what he is capable of doing. He came in, had 5 games with the Boston Bruins, and then he gets over to Calgary and he's behind Jacob Markstrom. Then he's behind Dustin Wolf. He comes over to Philadelphia in the offseason and he's battling. He's fighting for that number 1 spot. And I think he won it. I think he won it going into next year. I think he's won it for the playoffs, and he looked great in game 1. So a ton of fantasy value with this Flyers team. I would like for them to add someone on the back end because I still don't believe they have a true number 1 defenseman there. I know you've talked about Sanheim and Cam York from time to time, and they do bring some value as depth defensemen. I just don't think they have that number 1 guy. Maybe Jamie Drysdale can be that kind of offensive weapon. He got a goal in game 1 as well, but I'd like to see them add another piece on the blue line to add some more fantasy value for the entirety of the Flyers organization. Let's get over to the Boston Bruins. Pavel Zacha, I think, needs to be talked about a lot more than what the fantasy hockey community is not giving him credit for. Preseason ranking of 292nd, finished 127th. He went up 165 spots here. He had a career year, I believe, as well. And again, just a team that overachieved, overexcelled on what our expectations were going into this year. Pavel Zacha, 28 years old. I actually thought he was in his early 30s, but he's only 28 years old, 65 points, a career high, 30 goals, a career high, 131 shots, 64 hits. The peripherals for him, they're steady. They're nothing to be wowed about. They're not jaw-dropping, but he is a consistent factor for the Boston Bruins right there along Morgan Geekie and David Pastrnak up front.
When you take a look at this team on paper, it's not sexy. This is kind of the same old drum I've been beating on here with this Boston Bruins team, but I've been proven wrong. And you mentioned it right off the top. This is a whole bunch of overachievers. Victor Arvidsson, big bounce back year. Definitely one of those guys that if you looked at where, he wasn't even drafted, but where he started in terms of value ranked and where he finished, this guy's had a great year. Casey Middlestat even had a little bit of a resurgence. You look at a guy like Zacha, overachieved. Fraser Minton came out of nowhere. Even on, lower levels, a guy like Kuznetsov we talked about as a stream option. Yep. I don't know what the playoffs holds. I'm really excited to see how this series shakes out. I'm still going to say this one goes right down to the wire in 7 games.
Absolutely.
Buffalo is fired up, Steele. I'm excited to see how the first 2 games go with the Sabres, and we'll recap that as well. But definitely when you have Jeremy Swayman reinvigorated, playing confidently, that shows this team that they can do their thing up front. And that's why guys like this in Pavel Zacha can do what he does and overachieve and provide the fantasy value. There is one more player I very much want to talk about on this list, Steele, that plays for the New York Islanders that I want to talk about after the break. And whoever else you want to wrap up with, make sure you guys keep it tapped right here.
Absolutely. We got Steven Stamkos. We got Nick Schmaltz. We got Matt Barzal up and coming after the break, and a few more fantasy hockey risers here on Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. And once again, thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Pod your first listen every single day. Do us a favor out there. Take 1 second out of your day. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the follow button. Leave a 5-star review. It really does help the channel out so much. Once again, this is the final call for the NHL Playoff Bracket Challenge. I believe it closes Monday night. It might have already closed actually Sunday, but if you still want to join, it might be available. Link is in the Twitter pin to our profile there, so go check it out. We have over 30 members already. Again, crucial big prize on the line for the top team there. Flip, let's get to the New York Islanders. New York Islanders.
Thank you.
There were a few guys who jumped. Again, one of those guys who, again, depending on fantasy formats and point system, Matthew Schaefer was obviously on there. Preseason rank, I believe he was outside the 200 and finished in the top 50. He was an absolute stud. Obviously coming up a little bit short, but I just saw an incredible thing for him. He hit a $3.5 million bonus was what he was able to do this year. Goals, points, time on ice, all of those things. So big payday for the team over with the New York Islanders. But Matt Barzal, over to you, my friend. He came into the season preseason ranked 112th. He goes up 45 spots and finishes 67th in our categorical format. He had an unbelievable season as well that I don't think was talked enough about. And this was actually one of my guys in the preseason saying that this is going to be a great depth draft piece later in your drafts, somewhere in the 12th, 13th, maybe even 14th round. And I think he did exactly that for the New York Islanders this season.
Here's a few angles that I immediately go to with this team that makes me want to get behind a player in Matt Barzal that has so much talent that what you've seen from him over the last, just even over his career, comes into the league, 82 games, scores 85 points. You're thinking, okay, we might have a serious generational type talent on our hands here. Not in the 1A column, but, a guy bringing 90 points every year and you want him in your fantasy team. Follows it up with 62 points, and then obviously starts to dip down, some injuries, some inconsistent play, perhaps one of those cases where it's a little bit between the ears steals, some confidence issues, and then you see 72 points this year in 81 games and go, okay, this is one of the best north-south skaters in the game all day long. When you can skate like Matt Barzal and you got the puck on your stick type energy that this guy has, and he can really pop that seam with a dirty pass and create for teammates, I think this is a situation where you got Matty Schaefer there. You've got a rejuvenated Sorokin. You've got now DeBoer behind the bench, and things are looking neat and tidy there. Young pieces on the rise with the New York Islanders as well. Callum Ritchie, they got him in the Brock Nelson deal. Emil Heineman got him in the Dobson deal. And then Horvat and Matt Barzal in the mix deal. I'm really high on this player headed into next season. Sometimes I say on here, I don't like tipping my hand too early. This is a guy that I want next year. I think people are going to sleep on this Islanders team a little bit. This is their time. They've got everything in place, and Matthew Schaefer is a generational talent. So I think with this return you saw from Barzal, this is a player that I think, he was a big-time riser. But next year, don't be surprised if he brings that 90-point heat.
And that coaching change for the Islanders didn't pan out the same way as it did for the Vegas Golden Knights. But I think Pete DeBoer behind the bench is going to bring a new kind of mindset to this team as well. These are winners, but they've come up short a lot of the time over the last 5 to 10 years. It's, missing the playoffs by a few points or losing in the first round. And again, just coming up short. But I think Matt Barzal is going to be one of those guys who I think once again falls down the board, and you can draft if you can draft at the right time, he's going to be one of the best value picks for your fantasy hockey team. Let's get over to the Colorado Avalanche and kind of rattle off some of these guys that we want to mention before we get too long in the tooth here. Brock Nelson and Scott Wedgwood make the list as well. So Scott Wedgwood, preseason ranking in our league was 60th. He finishes top 10, actually, up 54 spots. Brock Nelson ranked in the preseason 135th. Goes up 91 spots and finishes 44th in our league. So I think those were two guys that, maybe Scott Wedgwood was one of those 0G strategies. You didn't know who the 1A goalie was going to be for the Avalanche, but he was fantastic all season long. He actually got his first start in the postseason. I know he had 3 games played for the Dallas Stars a couple of seasons ago, but it wasn't they weren't starts. He got his first win in his first start for the Colorado Avalanche against the Kings yesterday. He had a fantastic season. He gets the call as the number one guy, 31, 6-6 with a 921 save percentage, a 2.02 goals against average. And then also Brock Nelson, once again, I think a lot of doubters out there and what he could do for the Avalanche.
Yeah.
30-plus goals, 30-plus assists, 65 points on the season.
Yeah.
Brings a ton of fantasy value down the middle.
Aging like a fine wine as well. If 35 years old, he's got that 36 penalty minutes as well, Steele, 186 shots on net, and then you'll take 65 blocks and nearly 40 hits as well. So I also look at the Colorado Avalanche and what Brock Nelson brings to the table in terms of depth now at this point of the year, because I think what you and I are going to continue to do is walk this line of what's going on in the postseason and draw it back in with fantasy angles. Nathan McKinnon, Brock Nelson, Nazem Kadri up the middle. That's the best center trio in the NHL in terms of balance, I would say. You know, maybe Leon Draisaitl, Connor McDavid, and then whoever else is the third center in Edmonton. You throw them into the conversation. But this team is built to win, and Brock Nelson's balance that he has brought at 34 years old and 33 goals is a big reason why. Another veteran aging like a fine wine, though, Mr. Roden. And the biggest name on the board this year, I would say, maybe not in terms of the number change, because Dan Vladar gets it in terms of spots jumped, but Steven Stamkos at 128, that jump, and what he was able to do for the Nashville Predators, almost willing them into the postseason himself. What's your take on Stammer headed into next season? Because I know I really wanted him to go to a winner this year. He's just that loyal, and I heard he didn't want to go anywhere except back to Tampa, and I didn't see that happening. Over to you for your take on Stammer, a big-time riser this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had some really strong words at the end of the year press conference for the Nashville Predators. You know, he signed here. This wasn't a sign and dine type of situation. This was not him signing so he can join Nashville. Obviously, he wants to, but he wants to go to the postseason. He wants to go to the playoffs. He believes this is a Stanley Cup contending team. And again, they came up short. If they start off better in the at the beginning of the season, they're probably a playoff team here. And I think a lot of it has to fall on him because he started off really slow. The entire team didn't play well. Usually Saros wasn't great as well on the back end. But right. Steven Stamkos, I believe, only had 2 points in his first 10 or 12 games. And then obviously in the second half of the season, he finished with 42 goals on the year, 66 points, a big bounce back compared to what he put up last year, 53 points. But we know what he can do. And he showed us that he's still got a lot of gas in the tank. And when you look at some of the other pieces, and I still think Philip Forsberg is one of the most underrated stars in the league, especially fantasy hockey-wise. I think this is a guy who fills out the peripherals that you're always looking for, especially in categorical formats. They're going to have to change some things up. Obviously, they moved a couple of pieces at the trade deadline. You got some guys coming up in the system as well. We've talked about Luke Evangelista over the last number of years now. I think he's finally stepping into his own where he can be one of those top producing guys for the Nashville Predators. But Steven Stamkos, just looking at the graphic once again, jumps up 128 spots to finish top 10 in our fantasy hockey categorical league. So I think, this is a guy that is going to be sought out after once again next year. And again, if you can pick him in the right spot and not too early, he's going to be one of those value pieces for your team.
I think that's an interesting angle with a bunch of these players on there. And, we have a guy that wasn't mentioned on the show, Uri Slavkovsky. You got to talk about what's going on with the player itself, but what's going on with the team around them, where they're headed. And I think a big reason why, and you heard it throughout the conversation today, was a number of these teams are really pointed in the right direction, at least in terms of the Philadelphia Flyers, even a guy that also wasn't mentioned with Nick Schmaltz and the Utah Mammoth. I like what's going on with New York Islanders. Obviously, these teams that are in the playoffs, that's going well. All the different angles that you might not consider, we got you covered so that you can get that paper next season as well.
We talked about Nick Schmaltz as one of those overachieving players compared to where his average draft position was earlier, a few months ago. And I still think he definitely overachieved on what our expectations were. But this is going to be a team that is fighting tooth and nail every single season for the next number of years now with all the talent they have and everything they've got going right now in Utah. Lastly, real quickly, I just want to mention Jet Greaves because he's also on the list. I think this is a goaltender that I am putting on my target list for next year as well. With Rick Bowness coming back behind the bench. And again, he had some strong words for his team's compete level, even in a game that didn't matter. I like that attitude. I don't think it was vicious. I don't think it was malicious. I think that was just a coach who is competitive and wants to see this organization succeed. And we know he is a great coach behind the bench. And again, him going back next year with Jet Greaves, I think, to me, should be the number one guy. And maybe Elvis Merzlikins battles it out going into training camp next year. But Jet Greaves jumped up 118 spots to finish top 75 in our categorical format and just had a tremendous season. Again, another Eastern Conference team that just came up short in the last couple of games of the season.
That's Jet Greaves' crease now to lose, in my opinion. Not saying Merzlikins can't somehow take it away from him, but 55 games played, 2.60 goals against, 908 save percentage. Interestingly enough, we'll definitely be paying attention to what's going on with Columbus. A lot of good young players in the mix there. We've covered that. Yeah, Ricky B comes in, torches the team, gets a contract extension the next day. Absolute stud. Love Rick Bowness. Love these angles, Steele. Postseason hockey, I also adore. More fantasy takes coming up the rest of the week.
Game 2 action taking place Monday for a lot of these teams. Also, Game 1 for the Edmonton Oilers and Anaheim Ducks, the only team that hasn't played so far in the Stanley Cup playoffs, but we got all of that and more all week long. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Pod your first listen every single day. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode of fantasy hockey content. And we'll see you back here again tomorrow for Fantasy Hockey Playoffs.
Peace.